Imagine this. It's late at night and you're walking home after a long day. The streetlights flicker as you pass under them, and the sound of your footsteps echoes in the quiet neighborhood. You're almost at your doorstep when you notice something unusual. A dog standing in the middle of the road. But this isn't just any dog. Its eyes are locked onto you with an intensity that sends a chill down your spine. You pause, unsure of what to do. It doesn't bark or growl. It just stands there, watching, waiting. That dog's name is Max, and what happens next will change someone's life forever. Max was your typical family pet, or so everyone thought. A loyal golden retriever with a gentle temperament, he was the kind of dog that people trusted around kids, the one who'd greet you at the door with a wagging tail and big, warm eyes. But beneath Max's friendly exterior, there was something extraordinary, something nobody could have predicted. It started off as a normal day for the Hendersons, Max's family. Sarah Henderson, a busy single mom, was rushing through her morning routine, trying to get her son, Ethan, ready for school while juggling a full-time job and the never-ending demands of life. Ethan, a bright 10-year-old with an adventurous spirit, adored Max. They were inseparable, always playing in the yard or exploring the woods behind their house. To Ethan, Max wasn't just a pet, he was his best friend. But that evening, something changed. As Sarah was preparing dinner, Max began acting strange. He stood by the door, his body tense, ears alert, as if sensing something that no one else could. Sarah noticed, but brushed it off. "It's probably just a squirrel or something," she muttered, too caught up in the whirlwind of cooking, cleaning, and parenting. But Max wouldn't let it go. He whined, scratched at the door, and then he barked. Not his usual playful bark, but a deep, urgent sound that made Sarah stop what she was doing. Ethan ran over. "What's wrong, boy?" he asked, kneeling down to pet Max. But Max didn't respond like he usually did. Instead, he bolted out the door as soon as Sarah opened it, darting down the street with a speed that made her heart race. Something was definitely off. Without thinking, Ethan ran after him. "Max, wait!" he shouted as his small legs struggled to keep up. Panic rose in Sarah's chest as she grabbed her coat and keys, racing after them. The night air was cold, and the street was eerily quiet, aside from the sound of Ethan's fading voice. And then it happened. Max led them to an abandoned alley just a few blocks from their home, a place they'd never been before. Ethan and Sarah were out of breath by the time they caught up, but what they found there stopped them in their tracks. Max stood in front of a man lying on the ground, unconscious. His clothes were disheveled, his face pale, and there was a small trickle of blood on his forehead. Sarah gasped, pulling Ethan close to her. Max whined softly, nudging the man with his nose as if to say, "Help him." Sarah quickly fumbled for her phone, dialing 911 with trembling hands. "There's a man, he's unconscious. We need help," she told the operator, her voice shaking with fear. As she spoke, Ethan knelt down beside Max, his eyes wide with concern. "Mom, how did Max know?" Ethan whispered, glancing up at her. Sarah didn't have an answer. How did Max know? How did their sweet, gentle dog lead them to this exact spot, to this man who clearly needed help? And more importantly, who was this man? The sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. But as the flashing lights came into view, the unanswered questions only grew. Why had Max suddenly become so desperate to get to this place? What did he sense that they couldn't? And as they stood there in the dim glow of the streetlight, waiting for the paramedics to arrive, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger, something she couldn't quite understand. Because the truth was, Max knew more than any of them could have imagined. And what he knew was about to unravel a mystery that would turn their world upside down. But that's a story for another day. What happened in that alley was just the start of a series of events that no one could have predicted. Events that would challenge everything Sarah and Ethan thought they knew about their beloved dog. How had Max saved a life that night? What was he trying to tell them? And what dark secret had he uncovered? Stay tuned to find out the rest of the story, as we dig deeper into how one ordinary family pet became a hero, and the shocking truth that he uncovered in the process. The flashing lights of the ambulance lit up the dark alley, casting long shadows against the walls. Paramedics rushed over to the man on the ground, checking his pulse, asking questions, moving quickly to stabilize him. Sarah stood back, her hand tightly gripping Ethan's shoulder, both of them watching in stunned silence as Max stayed close by, his eyes never leaving the unconscious stranger. The whole scene felt surreal, like something out of a movie. How had they ended up here? Ethan was the first to break the silence. "Mom, is he going to be okay?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know, honey," Sarah replied, her own voice shaky. She wanted to reassure him, to tell him everything was going to be fine, but the truth was, she didn't know. None of this made sense. Why had Max led them here? What had happened to this man? One of the paramedics glanced over at Sarah. "Do you know him?" he asked, his tone brisk but not unkind. Sarah shook her head. "No, I've never seen him before," she said, her eyes darting back to the man. He looked young, maybe in his early 30s, with dark hair and a scruffy beard. There was something vaguely familiar about him, but Sarah couldn't place it. The paramedic nodded, satisfied for now with her answer, and turned back to his team. "We're taking him to the hospital. It looks like he suffered a head injury, possibly from a fall. We'll need to run more tests to see if there's anything else going on," he explained. As they loaded the man into the ambulance, Sarah felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Whoever this man was, he was in good hands now. But the questions still lingered. Why had Max been so insistent? What had drawn him to this exact spot? Max, sensing the tension, sat down beside Ethan and nudged his hand as if to say, "It's okay, I'm here." Ethan absent-mindedly scratched behind Max's ears, his brow furrowed in thought. He knew, Mom. Max knew something was wrong. Ethan said softly, glancing up at her with wide, questioning eyes. "How did he know?" "I don't know, sweetie," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady, though she felt just as confused. "But we'll figure it out." The next few days were a blur. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the man in the alley. She had called the hospital the morning after the incident, hoping to get an update, but they couldn't release any information due to privacy rules. The only thing she knew was that the man was stable and receiving treatment. That should have been enough to ease her mind, but it wasn't. Max, too, seemed different. He wasn't his usual playful self. He spent most of his time near the door or by the window, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. He still greeted them with his wagging tail and affectionate nuzzles, but there was a new sense of alertness in him, like he was constantly on guard. It was unsettling. Ethan noticed it too. "Do you think Max is okay?" he asked one evening as they sat on the couch, Max lying at their feet. Sarah glanced down at their dog, who was staring out the window, his ears twitching at every little sound. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Maybe he's just shaken up from what happened the other night. It's been a lot for all of us." But deep down, she wondered if there was more to it than that. The mystery of the man in the alley continued to weigh on her. Why had he been there? Had he been attacked? Or had it just been a freak accident? And why had Max been so desperate to lead them to him? There were too many questions and not nearly enough answers. A few days later, as Sarah was getting ready for work, there was a knock at the door. She wasn't expecting anyone, so her first thought was that it might be someone from the hospital, or maybe even the man himself. But when she opened the door, she was surprised to see a police officer standing on her porch. "Good morning, ma'am," the officer said, tipping his hat slightly. "I'm Officer Davis. I'm here to ask you a few questions about the incident that occurred the other night. I understand your dog Max was involved?" Sarah nodded, her heart racing. "Yes, that's right. Max led us to the man who was hurt." The officer nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I've heard. It's quite remarkable, actually. We don't see cases like this very often, where a pet seems to know something is wrong before anyone else does. It's almost as if Max sensed the danger." Sarah swallowed hard. "Do you know what happened to the man?" The officer hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "He's recovering well, but we're still investigating how he ended up in that alley. There are some unusual circumstances surrounding his case. We haven't ruled out foul play." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Foul play? The idea that the man in the alley might have been attacked hadn't even crossed her mind. She'd assumed it was some kind of accident, but now everything seemed even more complicated. "Do you think someone hurt him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're looking into it," Officer Davis said, his expression serious. "But right now we don't have enough information to say for sure. That's why I'm here. I was hoping you might remember anything unusual from that night. Did you see anyone else around? Hear anything out of the ordinary?" Sarah shook her head. "No, it was just Max. He started acting strange, like he knew something was wrong, and then he led us to the alley. By the time we got there, the man was already unconscious. The officer nodded, jotting down notes in his notepad. "And you're sure you didn't recognize the man? He didn't seem familiar to you at all?" Sarah hesitated. There had been something familiar about him, but she couldn't put her finger on it. "I don't know," she admitted. "He looked vaguely familiar, but I can't say for sure." The officer raised an eyebrow. "If anything comes to mind, even if it seems insignificant, please let us know." Sarah nodded, feeling a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. "Of course." After the officer left, Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over her. If the police thought there might have been foul play, that meant someone out there could be responsible for what happened to the man. And if that was true, then why had Max known? What had he sensed that night? Later that evening, as the house grew quiet and the soft glow of the moon filtered through the windows, Sarah sat on the couch, her mind racing. Ethan was asleep upstairs, but she couldn't relax. Max was lying by the door again, his head resting on his paws, his eyes alert. Sarah glanced over at him, her heart heavy with questions. "Max, what's going on?" she whispered, half hoping he could somehow answer. But Max just looked at her, his eyes full of something she couldn't quite read, something almost knowing. It was then that she realized this mystery was far from over. Max had led them to the man in the alley for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. The following days felt like a blur of uncertainty and tension that Sarah couldn't shake off. Every time she looked at Max, she saw the same unwavering focus in his eyes, as if he was still waiting for something to happen. It was unsettling. Max had always been an intelligent dog, but now there was a sharpness, an alertness to him that made her feel like he knew something she didn't, something important. Ethan, too, had picked up on it. He would sit beside Max, quietly stroking his fur, sometimes asking, "What's wrong, boy? What are you trying to tell us?" But Max remained silent, only offering soft, reassuring nudges in return. It was like they were all caught in this strange waiting game, and none of them knew what they were waiting for. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if the man from the alley was somehow connected to them. Officer Davis's visit had left her with more questions than answers, and the mention of foul play only added to her growing sense of unease. Who was that man? And why had Max been so determined to find him? One evening, after putting Ethan to bed, Sarah sat down with her laptop and began searching for any information she could find about the man in the alley. She didn't even know his name, but she started looking through local news reports, hoping for some clue. She scrolled through countless articles, most of them unrelated, until finally she found something. A small news report mentioned a man in his 30s who had been found unconscious in a nearby alley, just like the one Max had led them to. The article didn't reveal much, but it confirmed that the man had been taken to the hospital in stable condition. Still, there were no details about who he was or how he had ended up there. Just as Sarah was about to close the browser, something caught her eye, a missing persons report from a few weeks ago. The photo of the man stared back at her from the screen, and her heart skipped a beat. It was him, the man in the alley. His name was David Mitchell, and he had been missing for almost a month before they found him that night. But what was even more shocking was the small detail buried in the report. David Mitchell was a journalist. And not just any journalist, he had been working on an investigation into a local crime ring, exposing dangerous individuals involved in illegal activities. The words organized crime and threats jumped out at her from the article, sending a chill down her spine. This was no random accident. This man had been in danger, possibly even targeted, and somehow Max had known. But how? How had Max led them right to him in that exact moment? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft whine from Max, who had wandered over to her side. His large brown eyes looked up at her, as if he was trying to tell her something again. Sarah reached down and stroked his head, her mind racing. "Did you know, boy?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Did you know he was in trouble?" Max's ears twitched, and he licked her hand gently, his gaze never leaving hers. There was something in his eyes that she couldn't quite place, something urgent, almost pleading. The next morning, Sarah called Officer Davis, telling him what she had found. His reaction was measured but cautious. "That's interesting," he said, his tone serious. "We knew he was a journalist, but we didn't have many details about his investigation. If what you're saying is true, then David Mitchell may have been targeted. We're looking into all possibilities." The officer's words sent a new wave of anxiety washing over her. If David had been targeted, then someone dangerous might be involved. Someone who didn't want whatever he was investigating to come to light. And Max had somehow gotten involved in all of this, dragging them into the middle of something much bigger than she had realized. That night, sleep eluded her. Every creak in the house, every shadow outside made her heart race. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something, or someone, was out there. Even Max seemed more on edge, pacing by the front door, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. The breaking point came 2 nights later. It was late, the house quiet except for the faint sound of crickets outside. Sarah was lying in bed, her mind still racing with all the unanswered questions. Ethan was fast asleep, and Max had taken his usual spot by the door, ever watchful. But suddenly Max shot to his feet, his ears perked up and his body tense. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart pounding. "Max, what is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Max let out a low growl, something Sarah had rarely heard from him. He darted to the window, barking sharply now, his entire body rigid with alarm. Sarah's pulse quickened. She rushed to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. There, in the shadows near the edge of their property, she saw movement. A figure, just barely visible in the darkness, standing by the fence. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Someone was out there watching. She stumbled back, her hands trembling as she grabbed her phone, dialing 911 with shaky fingers. "There's someone outside my house," she whispered into the phone, her voice trembling. "Please send someone quickly." Max continued barking, his growls deepening as the figure in the shadows moved closer. Sarah's heart raced as she ran to Ethan's room, shaking him awake. "Ethan, wake up, sweetie," she said urgently. "We need to go." Ethan blinked up at her, confused and groggy. "Mom? What's happening?" "Someone's outside," she said, trying to keep her voice calm but firm. "We need to stay in your room until the police arrive." Max barked again, louder this time, as if he was trying to warn them. Sarah could hear the distant wail of sirens now, growing closer. But the figure outside wasn't retreating. They were still there, watching, waiting. The minutes felt like hours. Sarah stood in Ethan's room, her arms wrapped tightly around him, listening to the sound of Max's relentless barks and the approaching sirens. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with fear and confusion. Why were they being watched? Was it connected to David Mitchell? Had someone followed them, knowing they had discovered something? The sirens grew louder, and soon, flashing blue and red lights filled the street outside. The police had arrived. Max stopped barking but remained tense, standing by the window, watching as the officers swarmed the yard. Sarah breathed a sigh of relief, but the tension in her chest didn't ease. The police searched the property, but by the time they reached the spot where the figure had been, there was no one there. The shadowy figure had disappeared, leaving nothing but uncertainty and fear in its wake. Officer Davis was one of the officers who arrived at the scene. After searching the area and finding no trace of the intruder, he spoke to Sarah, his expression grim. "We couldn't find anyone, but based on what you described, I'd say it's possible someone was watching the house. It could be connected to David Mitchell's case." Sarah's stomach twisted with dread. "So we're in danger?" "I can't say for sure," Davis replied. "But if this is connected to his investigation, then whoever's behind it might be trying to tie up loose ends." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Loose ends? You think they're after us?" "It's a possibility," Davis said, his tone cautious. "I'll arrange for extra patrols in the area just to be safe. But for now, stay vigilant. If anything else happens, call us immediately." As the police left, the weight of the situation settled heavily on Sarah's shoulders. They were being watched, and whoever was behind it wasn't going to stop until they got what they wanted. Max, still standing by the window, gave one last low growl, his eyes fixed on the darkened street. Whatever was coming, they weren't out of the woods yet. The silence that filled the house after the police left was suffocating. Sarah sat on the edge of her couch, the tension coiled tightly in her chest, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. Max lay at her feet, his body still alert, his ears twitching at every little sound. Ethan had fallen back asleep, but Sarah knew she wouldn't be able to rest. How could she, knowing that someone might be watching them? The police had left her with more questions than answers, and even though they promised extra patrols, the weight of fear lingered. The idea that they were caught in something so dangerous felt unreal. What had David Mitchell uncovered that had brought this threat to their doorstep? And why had Max been so attuned to it from the beginning? Just as Sarah was lost in thought, her phone buzzed on the table, jolting her out of her haze. It was a number she didn't recognize. For a moment, she hesitated, her heart skipping a beat. What if it was someone connected to the people who were after David? But then curiosity and a gut feeling pushed her to answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice cautious. There was a pause on the other end before a man's voice spoke, low and urgent. "Is this Sarah?" he asked. Her heart raced. "Yes." "Who is this?" The man hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. "My name is David Mitchell." Sarah froze, the room seeming to tilt around her. "David Mitchell? But how? I know this is strange," he interrupted, his voice still tense. "But I need you to listen carefully. I don't have much time, and I need you to trust me." Her mind was spinning, her grip tightening on the phone. "You were the man in the alley," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "We found you." "Your dog found me," David corrected. "He saved my life. And because of that, I need to warn you. The people I've been investigating, they know you found me. They know your dog is different." Sarah felt her blood run cold. "What do you mean, different? I don't know how else to say this, but your dog, Max, he's not just any ordinary dog. He's special. That's why he found me. He can sense things most humans can't." Sarah's head was spinning. This didn't make any sense. Max was just a regular dog. "Wasn't he?" She looked down at Max, who had lifted his head and was now staring at her, as if he knew exactly what was being said. "I don't understand," Sarah said, shaking her head. "How is that possible? What do you mean he can sense things?" "I'm not sure of all the details," David replied quickly, his voice still urgent. "But the people I was investigating, they've been involved in some very dark activities. Things that go beyond just crime. Experiments, Sarah. On animals. On humans. Max might be one of their experiments." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What? That can't be true. Max has been with us for years. He's just a dog." "I know it sounds crazy," David said, his voice softer now, but still insistent. "But trust me, the things I've uncovered, they're dangerous. Max's ability to sense danger, to lead you to me that night, it's not a coincidence. And now those people know he's involved. They'll come after him, and after you." The room seemed to close in on Sarah, her mind reeling from the weight of his words. Experiments? Max? Part of some dangerous plot? None of this made sense, and yet deep down, something about it rang true. She had always known Max was special, more in tune with the world around him than any other pet she'd ever had. But she'd never imagined it could be something like this. "We need to leave," she whispered, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. "Right now." Ethan blinked up at her in confusion, rubbing his eyes. "But why? What's happening?" "I'll explain later," she said, pulling him out of bed. "Just trust me. We need to go." Max followed them, his steps quick and focused, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Sarah threw a few essentials into a bag, clothes, her phone, Max's leash, her mind racing as she tried to think of a plan. Where could they go? How could they outrun people who seemed to have eyes everywhere? As they crept down the stairs, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were already being watched. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified in the silence of the night. Her breath came in shallow, uneven bursts as she led Ethan and Max toward the back door. But just as they reached the door, a shadow moved outside the window and Sarah froze. Someone was there. Her heart slammed in her chest and she pulled Ethan behind her, her grip on Max's leash tightening. Max stood beside her, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the shadow outside. He let out a low growl and Sarah knew they didn't have much time. Whoever was out there, they weren't here by accident. She glanced around the room, looking for anything she could use to protect them, but her mind was racing too fast to focus. The figure outside shifted again, and she heard the faintest sound of footsteps approaching the door. Max's growl deepened, his body ready to spring into action, and for the first time, Sarah realized just how much they were relying on him. He wasn't just their dog anymore. He was their protector, their guide, and maybe even their only chance of making it out of this alive. The door handle rattled, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Time was running out. The tension in the air was almost unbearable, the danger closing in on them with every passing second. Max let out a sharp bark, and the sound seemed to echo through the house like a warning. Whoever was outside, they weren't alone anymore. Max was ready for them. And whatever happened next, Sarah knew one thing for certain. They couldn't afford to lose. Not now. Not with everything on the line. The door handle rattled again, harder this time, and Sarah's heart pounded so loudly she thought it might give them away. Max was still growling, his whole body tense, every muscle coiled, ready to defend them. The air in the room felt thick, each second dragging out painfully as they waited for what would happen next. Then there was a loud bang. The door burst open and a figure rushed in, dressed in dark clothing, face partially hidden. Everything seemed to happen at once. Max lunged forward, barking ferociously, his growls deep and menacing. Sarah pulled Ethan behind her, her mind racing, trying to stay calm as the intruder stumbled backward, startled by Max's sudden attack. "Max!" Sarah cried, her voice shaking, unsure of what to do. But Max was focused, his instincts sharp, keeping the man at bay. The intruder scrambled to regain his balance, but Max was already on him, growling and snapping, forcing the man to retreat. For a brief moment, Sarah thought it was over. Max had scared him off. They were safe. But then, something happened that made her blood run cold. The man didn't run. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out something small and dark. A device. He pressed a button, and a piercing, high-pitched sound filled the room, so sharp and loud that Sarah covered her ears in pain. Max stopped barking immediately, yelping in distress, backing away from the man. The sound seemed to affect him directly, and Sarah watched in horror as her strong, fearless dog collapsed onto the floor, whining, his body twitching as if he was being controlled by the sound. "Max!" Sarah screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. She didn't know what to do. She tried to shake him to get him to stand, but he was unresponsive, his body limp and trembling. The man stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Max. "I knew it," he muttered under his breath, barely glancing at Sarah and Ethan. "He's one of them." "What did you do to him?" Sarah shouted, her voice raw with fear and anger. The man didn't answer. Instead, he knelt beside Max, his hand reaching for a small device he'd hidden under his coat. "He's part of something much bigger than you realize," the man said coldly, "and we can't let him, or you, leave." Sarah's mind raced, her hands shaking as she clutched Ethan tightly. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her loyal, loving dog, reduced to this state, controlled by some kind of cruel device. It was like all the pieces were finally falling into place, but none of it made any sense. Max wasn't just an ordinary dog, he really was special. And this man knew it. But as she stared at Max, her mind spinning with panic, she realized something else. Sarah looked down at her son, her heart aching with the weight of what he had just been through. She wanted to protect him, to shield him from the darker truths of the world, but she also knew that he deserved answers, at least some of them. They were people who didn't understand Max, she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. They thought he was different and wanted to take him back. But Max belongs here, with us, and no one is going to take him away. Ethan seemed to accept her answer, though his eyes still held the remnants of fear. He reached out to pat Max's head, and the dog wagged his tail, reassuring them both with his steady presence. Max, the protector, had done his job well. As the adrenaline began to fade, Sarah's mind turned to the bigger picture. David Mitchell was still out there, on the run from dangerous people. And the woman who had appeared tonight, who was she really? Her explanation had been brief, but there were still so many unanswered questions. What exactly was this program that Max had been a part of? And were they truly safe now? For the next few days, Sarah kept a low profile, trying to process everything that had happened. She made sure the doors were always locked, and Max stayed close to her and Ethan, alert and watchful. She couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease, but there were no more strange visitors, no more shadowy figures lurking outside their house. The police checked in once, following up on the strange disturbance that had been reported, but Sarah didn't tell them everything. What could she say? That her dog had been part of a secret government experiment? That strange people had broken into her home, only to leave when a mysterious woman intervened? It all sounded too unbelievable even to her. Instead, she focused on moving forward. Life somehow had to go on. Max, for his part, seemed to return to his old self, loving, protective, always at their side. But Sarah noticed little things now, things she hadn't paid attention to before. The way Max would tilt his head, as if listening to something beyond their range of hearing. The way he seemed to know when someone was approaching the house, even before the doorbell rang. And the way he stayed closer to Ethan than ever before, as if he understood just how important his role in their family had become. One afternoon, about a week after the break-in, Sarah received a call. Her heart leapt into her throat when she saw the number. It was the same unknown number from before. "David." With trembling hands, she answered. "Sarah," came David's voice, still low and urgent, but calmer than it had been the last time they spoke. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay." "Did they come for Max?" "They did," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions flooding her. "But they didn't take him. Someone stopped them." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Good," David said finally. "I'm glad you're safe. Max is more important than you realize. But I think you've figured that out by now. Who was that woman?" Sarah asked, unable to keep the question in any longer. "The one who stopped them?" She seemed to know what was going on. David sighed. "She was part of the same group that created Max. But unlike some of the others, she believes in what Max was really meant for, to help, to protect. She's been trying to keep people like you out of harm's way. Is it over?" Sarah asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Are we safe now?" There was another pause, longer this time, and Sarah's heart sank at the silence. "I don't know," David admitted. "But for now, I think they'll leave you alone. Max has proven that he's where he belongs. They won't risk drawing more attention to themselves." Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It wasn't the complete reassurance she had been hoping for, but it was something. "Thank you, David," she said softly, "for warning us, for telling us the truth." "You deserve to know," David replied. "Just be careful. If anything else happens, if you ever feel like something's wrong, don't hesitate to leave. Max will know what to do." The call ended, leaving Sarah feeling both relieved and unsettled. She had hoped for more clarity, for a clean resolution, but perhaps this was the best she could hope for. Life would go on, and with Max by their side, she knew they would be okay. They had to be. As the days turned into weeks, the sense of danger gradually faded, though it never disappeared completely. Sarah kept an eye on the news, watching for any mention of strange occurrences or unexplained disappearances. But nothing came. It was as if the shadowy figures from that night had simply vanished, leaving them to their quiet, ordinary life. Ethan seemed to recover faster than Sarah had expected. Children had a remarkable ability to adapt, and soon, the fear of that night was just a distant memory. He returned to school, played with his friends, and treated Max like the hero he truly was. Every now and then, Ethan would ask about what had happened, but Sarah kept her answers simple. There was no need to burden him with more than he needed to know. As for Max, he remained their steadfast protector. Sarah noticed how much more attuned she had become to him, how deeply she appreciated the bond they shared. Max had always been special, but now she understood just how extraordinary he really was. He wasn't just a dog, he was family. And no matter what secrets his past held, Sarah knew one thing for certain: they were stronger together. One quiet evening, months after everything had happened, Sarah sat on the porch with Max by her side, watching the sunset. The sky was a mix of pinks and oranges, the air warm and still. Ethan was inside, playing a game, his laughter drifting through the open window. Sarah reached down, stroking Max's fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. "We've been through a lot, haven't we, boy?" she whispered, her voice soft. Max turned his head, looking up at her with those deep, intelligent eyes. His tail thumped gently against the floor, as if to say, "Yes, but we made it." And they had. Despite the fear, the danger, and the unknowns, they had made it through together. Sarah smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over her. Whatever the future held, she knew they could face it. In the distance, a bird called out, its song echoing in the evening air. Max's ears perked up, always alert, always ready. Sarah laughed softly, shaking her head. Some things never change, she murmured, feeling a warmth in her heart that hadn't been there in a long time. Max stood, stretching lazily before sitting down beside her. His body pressed close against her leg. It was as if he could sense her contentment, her relief. And maybe in his own way he could. As the last light of the day faded, Sarah leaned back, letting the calm of the evening wash over her. The world outside might still hold its dangers, its mysteries, but here, in this moment, they were safe. Max had seen to that, and for Sarah, that was enough.